We are live.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ICHRRF Friday Seminar Series for our Fellowship Training Program in Human Rights. My name is Dr. Adityanjee. I'm the President of ICHRRF as well as Fellowship Training Director. So this is the first seminar series of our summer program. ICHRRF stands for International Commission for Human Rights and Religious Freedom. And in this slide, you see our logo. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the executive team of the ICHRRF, I invite our audience to yet another seminar in the ICHRRF Professor Ved Prakash Nanda Fellowship Training Program Seminar Series. Our distinguished faculty includes Professor Ved P. Nanda, Professor Yashwant Pathak, Professor Nalini Rao, Professor Lavanya Vemsani, myself, Dr. Adityanjee, our Executive Director, Mr. Carl Clements, our Director of Legal and Policy Affairs, Mr. Hardam Tripathi, Dr. Yashodhan Agolgaonkar, Professor Nidhi Shandurnirkar, and Dr. Richard Bankint. Currently, we have two fellows, Ripudaman Pachauri, he is from January 2022 batch, and Anushri Gisad, who is from July 22 batch. The seminar series has a standard format. There's initial 25 minutes presentation by the fellow. Then it is followed by 10 minutes comments by the chief mentor, Professor Ved Nanda. This is followed by 25 minutes discussion of the topic by the faculty preceptor for that particular seminar. And last 30 minutes, we have a open question and answer session, which is very, very informative. So the topic for today's fellowship seminar is History of the Human Rights Movement. And of course, today is Friday, July 8, 2022. The presentation for today's seminar is to be done by our fellow Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri, and I will be the faculty preceptor. There are a couple of announcements. From July 1st, 2022, Anushri Gisad joined our fellowship training program. We have a couple of applications pending for January 23 session, but we would like more applicants. So if you know someone who is interested, please talk to them. Our special hearing report on Kashmiri Hindu genocide will be scheduled for release later in the month of July. The report is being finalized, and we are inviting volunteer faculty at any point in time for this fellowship training program. If anyone you know is interested, if you yourself are interested in being part of the faculty preceptors, please let me know. Some housekeeping rules. Please stay on mute to avoid noise interference. Please change your cell phone setting to vibration mode so that unwanted calls do not interrupt the program. Please do not try to interrupt our fellow or whoever's the faculty preceptor when they are talking. Only those members of the audience who identify themselves openly will be allowed to ask questions. So we don't allow anonymous questioners. All the questions have to be sent through a chat function. The questions have to be very specific and precise. We don't want a lecture or a monologue in the form of comments. Finally, this presentation or seminar is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel as well as on our website. So with this introduction, I invite our fellow, Mr. Ripudaman Pachauri, who will be talking about history of human rights movements. And I know that he has done very hard work. He has a 12-page long document he has prepared. So let's welcome Ripudaman Pachauri for his presentation. Ripudaman, please go ahead.
Thank you, Adityanjee. Um, Thank you for giving me a chance to talk on this topic. So, um, regarding history of human rights, in this talk, I'll basically cover some of the major historical events, including, um, the laws related to um, um, the human rights and human rights violation, history of human right violation also, and the steps that have been taken throughout the history. Not so, so history is would be I would consider it as a short history, but whatever the incidents that I'm covering, it would be related to basically when the laws were made and major events, including the human rights violations and the state and the non-state actors who acted on those violations, um, and to make sure that it would not happen uh, again in the future. So, human rights. Um, So the belief that everyone is entitled to certain human rights is fairly new. Its roots, however, lie in earlier tradition and documents of many cultures. It took the catalyst of World War II to propel human rights onto the global stage and into the global consensus. Throughout much of the history, people acquired rights and responsibilities through their membership in a group, a family, indigenous nation, religion, class, community, or state. Most societies have had traditions similar to the golden rule of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The Hindu Vedas, the Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, the Bible, the Quran, and the Anaclets of Confucius are five of the oldest written sources which address questions of people's duties, rights, and responsibilities. In addition, the Inca and the Aztec codes of conduct and justice and an Iroquois constitution were Native American sources that existed well before 18th century. In fact, all societies, whether in oral or written traditions, have had system of proprietary, property and justice, as well as um, ways of tending to the health and welfare of their members. Historically, um, in the Eastern world, the code of conduct were decided unanimously after debate amongst the intellectual groups. In contrast, in the Western world, the king could legislate um, and king could decide everything. There were concept of code of conduct which people were supposed to follow, comprising of rights, duties, responsibilities um, of an individual and the state, uh, and were decided amongst the intellectuals and sorry. Um there were concept of code of conduct which people were supposed to follow, comprising of rights, duty, and responsibilities of an individual. The conduct like perseverance, self-restraint, forgiveness, not to steal, not to take possession of other without permission, internal and external purification of senses, attaining truth and knowledge, and abstracting from anger. So it was this code of conduct of the people used to and supposed to people used to and supposed to follow rather than laws imposed by the king. In fact, king was also working under those code of conducts. So the ethic was at the helm of these codes. And there were a lot of written and oral traditions or unspoken laws to keep the humanity intact. In modern day Iraq, Hammurabi, king of Babylon, Mesopotamia, who ruled homogeneous population about 2000 BC, established the first judiciary system with set of 282 laws. His set of rules, known as the Code of Hammurabi, were the most comprehensive set of laws in the ancient world. These laws were written on 12 stones and displayed in public so that everyone could see them. In Western world, Plato and Aristotle from Greece wrote books on ethics and natural justice. The human right laws were derived from Magna Carta law during the time of King John of England in 1215 AD, are the basis of the modern day human right laws. Some historical reference of human right violations. From the rampant violence and the sexual abuse of women to the crime against the humanity conducted by the dictators, human rights violations are occurring worldwide. International human rights advocates remained tenacious, inciting massive protest and public condemnation to bring the consequences to those who strip humans of their most basic rights. But sadly, our efforts to stop them have not been enough, or the violating parties, both the state and non-state, sometimes have had committed the human rights violations in the past, and to cover up their own act, they pick up the HR-related cases of other countries. Good example of it is Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombing during Second World War and trial of Japanese leadership. Another example is the mass rape of German women by the soldiers of Allied forces, which continued even after the victory of Allied forces. None of the British and the American officers were tried for those crimes. Some major historical um, human right violation incidents that I'm going to cover. There are tons of those incidents, but I'm going to cover a few of them for the sake of this presentation. The child slavery in the LRA. For 18 years, the Lord's Resistance Army, LRA, guerrillas of northern Uganda, has been kidnapping boys to train them as soldiers and girls to turn them into sexual slaves of the commanders. In 2002, as many as 20,000 children were controlled by the LRA. Forced sterilization of disabled underage girls. The involuntary sterilization of disabled underage girls in Australia is still lawful, was still lawful um, as of 2014. I do not know what's the current status of this law. Sex workers units and camps sponsored by the Japanese army for their soldiers during the World War II. Many of the captured Chinese women were kept in these camps and were used as the sex slaves. Child labor during the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, children as young as 6 years old worked up to 19 hours a day for little or no pay in horrid, dangerous conditions. Slavery in United States, everyone is aware of that. After being brought to the American colonies, Africans were stripped of human rights, enslaved, brutally treated, and considered lesser than their fellow human beings for centuries. The discrimination and the violation of the African American human rights did not end after slavery was abolished. After separate bathrooms and schools to belittlement and judgment of individuals based on their skin color, African Americans were stripped of their rights in America until 1964. In America, in the recent time, we have observed the COVID-19 vaccines or the chemicals used to produce these vaccines were denied by United States to the third world countries. Um, And similar um, incident happened during the World War II also. The antibiotics were denied to the minorities and the soldiers, injured soldiers in the armed forces in the United States. Um, and there were forced religious conversions and genocide of indigenous Indian population of Indian subcontinent for over thousand years by the foreign invaders. Some other contemporary examples are Nigerian oppression by Boko Haram, Yemen crisis, Syrian crisis, China's re-education camp of Uyghur Muslims. There's a big list published by US of HR abuses um, in countries including Iran, Afghanistan, Sudan, Pakistan, Lebanon, Belarus, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, Myanmar, North Korea, etc. Now, if you observe that the state as well as um, non-state actors um, like corporates, terrorist groups, communities, religious groups, all were involved in one or another kind of HR violation activities at one point or another. I'll cover the precursors of 20th century human rights documents. Um, Documents asserting individual rights, such as Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, 1689, the French Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, 1789, and the US Constitution and Bill of Rights, 1791, are the written precursors of many of today's human rights documents. Yet many of these documents, when originally translated into policies, excluded women, children, people of color, and the members of certain social, religious, economic, and political groups. Nevertheless, oppressed people throughout the world have drawn on the principles these documents express to support revolutions that assert the right to self-determination. Contemporary international rights law and the establishment of United Nations have important historical uh, antecedents. Effort in the 19th century to prohibit the slave trade and to limit the horrors of the war are prime examples. In 1919, countries established the International Labour Organization, ILO, to oversee treaties protecting workers with respect to their rights, including their health and safety. Concerns over protection of certain minority groups was raised by the League of Nations at the end of the First World War. However, this organization for international peace and cooperation created by the victorious European allies uh, never achieved its goal. The League floundered because the United States refused to join and because the League failed to prevent Japan's invasion of China and Manchuria in 1931 and Italy's attack on Ethiopia in 1935. It finally died with the onset of the Second World War in 1939. The birth of the United Nations, the idea of the human rights emerged stronger after Second World War. The extermination by the Nazi Germany of over 6 million Jews, Sinti and Romani gypsies, homosexuals, and the person with the disabilities horrified the world. Trials were held in Nuremberg and Tokyo after World War II, and officials from the defeated countries were punished for committing war crimes, crime against peace, and crime against humanity. Governments then committed themselves to establishing the United Nations with the primary goal of bolstering international peace, and preventing conflict. People wanted to ensure that never again would anyone be unjustly denied life, freedom, food, shelter, and nationality. The essence of these emerging human rights principles were captured in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1941 State of the Union address, when he spoke of the world founded on four essential freedoms: freedom of speech, religion, and freedom from want and fear. And um, the calls came from across the globe for human rights standard to protect citizens from abuses by the government. The standard against which nation could be held accountable for the treatment of those living their borders within their borders. These voices played a critical role in San Francisco meeting that drafted the United Nations Charter in 1945. Now, a little history of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The member states of the United Nations pledged to promote respect for the human rights of all. To advance this goal, the UN established a Commission for Human Rights and charged it with the task of drafting a document spelling out the meaning of the fundamental rights and freedom and the freedoms proclaimed in the Charter. The Commission, guided by Eleanor Roosevelt's forceful leadership, captured the world's attention. On December 10, 1948, Universal Declaration of Human Rights (UDHR) was adopted by 56 members of United Nations. The vote was unanimous, although 8 nations chose to abstain. The influence of UDHR has been substantial. Its principles have been incorporated into the constitutions of most of the more than 185 nations now in the UN. Although a declaration is not a legal binding document, the Universal Declaration has achieved the status of customary international law because people regard it as a common standard of achievement for all people and all nations. Human rights covenants. When the goal of establishing mechanism for forcing the UDHR uh, enforcing the UDHR, the UN Commission of Human Rights proceeded to draft two treaties: the International Covenant of Civil and the Political Rights (ICCPR) and its optional protocol, and the International uh, Covenant of Economic, Social, Cultural Rights (ICESCR). Together with the Universal Declaration, they are commonly referred to as International Bill of Human Rights. The ICCPR focuses on the issues as the right of life, freedom of speech, religion, and voting. And ICESCR focuses on the issues as food, education, health, shelter. Both covenants trumped the extension of rights to all persons in the private discrimination. As of 1997, over 130 nations have ratified these covenants. The United States, however, has ratified only ICCPR, and even that with many reservations or formal exceptions to its full compliance. Now, after that, there have been a lot of subsequent human rights documents were drafted um, in various conventions. Um, the conventions um, on the elimination of all forms of radical discrimination, Convention of Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Convention on the Political Rights of the Women, Slavery, Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, and degrading treatment or punishments. In Europe, the Americas and Africa, um, regional document for the protection and the promotion of the human rights extend to International Bill of Human Rights. For example, African states have created their own Charter of Human and the People Rights in 1981, and Muslim states have created the Cairo Declaration on Human Rights in Islam in 1990. The dramatic changes in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Latin America since 1989 have powerfully demonstrated a surge in demand for respect of human rights. Popular movements in China, Korea, and Asian countries reveal a similar commitment to these principles. Um, Now, there have been some role of some non-government organizations as well. Some NGOs work tirelessly over the period of time and work with the state governments to implement or modify the existing laws um, related to it. The NGOs such as Amnesty International, the Anti-Slavery Society, the International Commission of Jurists, the International Working Group, uh, Indigenous Affairs, Human Rights Watch, Minnesota Advocates for Human Rights, and Survivors International. These organizations monitor the action of the governments and um, pressurize them to act according to the human rights principle. Um, Now um, I'll just cover a little bit on the um, concept or evolution of the human rights. Um, in 1945 in San Francisco, we have already covered a little bit earlier also, 50 nations adopted a United Nations Charter, a document setting forth the United Nations goal, functions, and the responsibilities. Article 1 of the Charter states that one of the aim of the UN is to achieve international cooperation in promoting and encouraging respect of human rights and for fundamental freedoms uh, for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, and religion. The goal of the article of the Charter are of a general nature. For those goals to be achieved, specific human rights and freedoms needed to be defined first, then laws and the procedures had to be drawn up that would promote and protect those rights and freedom. For those purposes, the Commission on Human Rights was established and charged with the creating of International Bill of Human Rights that we briefly covered earlier. Um, how the reporting and the monitoring being done by these groups. Every convention contains articles that establish procedures for monitoring and reporting. How state parties, governments that have ratified the document are complying with it. Both convenants, for example, provide for a body of independent experts to monitor government compliance with treaty provisions. Articles in the ICCPR establish a human rights committee consisting of 18 independent experts who examines progress of reports from states that are party to the covenants. The committee also can consider complaints of other members of state against another. In addition, the ICCPR provides a complaint procedure through which individuals can have grievances against their governments heard in an international forum. Steps in the evolution of the conventions, various conventions. So before they become codified as binding law, human right concepts must pass through a lengthy process that involves consensus building and practical politics at the international and the national level. So this is, I'm going a little diverted here from the topic of history, but I'm just covering this because these evolution of these conventions had various steps, and many of the founding members of these bodies, international human rights bodies, they themselves didn't participate fully in these processes, or they do not agree with the many of the documents presented in conventions. So I'll just briefly cover like these in so I was saying there's a lengthy process that involves consensus building and the practical politics at the international and the national levels. Number one is the drafted by the working groups, UN General Assembly Commission groups, working group consisting of representatives of UN member states as well as the representatives of the intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, then adopted by the vote of the General Assembly, signed by the member states, ratified by the member states, and then entered into force. A convention goes into effect when a certain number of member states have ratified it. For example, ICCPR, ICESCR were adopted in 1966. However, they did not enter into force until 1976, when the specified number of 35 member states had ratified them. Um, since um, again the now the evolution of the human rights laws, I briefly covered earlier also. Since 1948, UDHR has served as the foundation of 20 major human rights conventions. Many human rights conventions have entered into force. Some are still in the process of ratifications. Others, such as Convention of the Rights of Indigenous People and the Convention of the Environmental Rights, are presently being drafted. As the needs of the certain groups of people are recognized and defined, and as world events point to the need of awareness and the action on specific human rights issues, international human rights laws continuously evolves in response. The ultimate goal is to protect and promote the basic human rights of every person everywhere. Um, the principal human rights conventions, as part of the contemporary history, the Convention on the Prevention of Punishment and the Crime of Genocide happened in 1948. Convention for the Suppression of the Traffic in person and of the exploitation of the prostitution of others in 1949, Convention relating to the status of refugees in 1951, a slavery convention in 1953, political rights for women 1953, and so on. And the lately 1990, the rights of migrant workers and the members of their families in 1990. Um, there are certain conventions like this one, the last one that I mentioned about the rights of the migrant workers and the rights of the child, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. US has not ratified these conventions to the date. Um, the UN General Assembly date refer all these date refers to the year the UN General Assembly adopted the conventions. Um, So after that, there have been many events in the history of United Nations. Many organizations were formed. Um, that would be uh, it is related to the human rights, but not kind of directly related to the history of human right violation itself. So I would kind of skip those things. Um, but I will also mention that some bodies like UN Security Council was also established to cater the human rights. It comprising of 15 member states, is responsible for making decisions regarding the international peace and security. It can make recommendations and the decisions for actions, including providing humanitarian aid, imposing economic sanctions, and recommending peacekeeping operations. For example, special tribunals have been set up to prosecute war crimes in the former Yugoslavia and acts of genocide in Rwanda. In the last, I would like to finish my presentation by mentioning one of the important event in the history um, of the um, and the well of there was a well-known, everyone knows the well-known philosopher and scholar Socrates. Um, he was about 400 BCE. He presented this whole idea of ethics and morals in the political system, which was the basis of all the human right laws in to this state. For introducing this idea, he was punished by the state by giving, and he was killed by giving the poison, and he was forced to drink poison. And with that, um the biggest um, human right violation, I would say, was committed against this um, humanity and against this whole world. That's with this statement, I would like to um, finish my presentation, and I hope that new laws will be formed with the idea of ethics and moral at the helm while defining the laws for disrupting humanity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ripudaman, for giving a very detailed presentation on history of human rights, but more contemporary history of human rights. Uh, Next week, we are going to have a special seminar on international covenants and treaties. So that is a topic we would rather focus next week rather than in today's presentation. The reason this seminar is there to give it actually much wider perspective to the ideas and concept of human rights. Human rights as conceptualized today have a very, very definite Western and imperialistic orientation. We hark back to Second World War, you know, as soon as we talk about human rights, League of Nations, International Covenant of Human Rights, and Bill of Human Rights, and things like that. Having said that, human race has been there for a long period of time. Was there no concept of human rights in other civilizations except for Western civilization? And that's why it is very, very imperative that we critically evaluate the concept of human rights as we understand today, how it was in other societies. At this point in time, there's just a dichotomy, individual rights versus states' rights. But in other civilizations, a much more balanced, you know, understanding is there about human rights. What I like to call is a diamond of human rights or diamond of humanity, which balances individual human rights against human dignity. If we hark too much on individual human rights, right of you to practice your belief system, if it demeans another individual by othering the other individual, how good is that human rights? So an individual human right is always to be balanced about overall human dignity, dignity of other people. You can say I have right to do this thing, but if your right to do this thing actually ends in end of life for another human being, that is not a good example of, championing individual human rights. Human rights of whom and against whom, that is a very important issue. So in the diamond of human dignity, there are four corners: individual human rights, human dignity, human duties, and human responsibilities. Unfortunately, the Western conceptualization of human rights does not take into consideration the concept of human dignity. It, fallaciously focuses more on individual human rights and less on human dignity. And there's no concept of human duties and human responsibilities as conceptualized in international law at this point in time. And I think that needs to be rectified. Whether there are treaties and covenants at this point in time is not the issue. Issue is that we have to look at the whole problem in a holistic manner. So individual rights are pitted against rights of the state. But there are other entities that impact on not only the individual's rights, but also the rights of communities. So there are transnational organizations. There are multinational businesses that have extreme amount of power, both economic and political, and that interferes with the human dignity of a number of individuals. Technically, these are not state powers. So again, pitting individual human rights versus state, that dichotomy is not a good dichotomy. We have to look at individuals' rights, states' rights, and then look at the non-state actors, which may be corporate sector, which may be terrorist organizations, which may be religious cults. You know, a right to a religious cult, freedom of belief in Georgetown in Guyana led to murder of 2,000 individuals. So there are nuances, and we cannot take an extremist view of individual human rights as the only concept to champion. And of course, when you have large transnational organizations pitted against the small person or the smaller entities, like a village, like a rural community, like small groups, whose rights are we going to uphold? I think that is very, very relevant. So again, we have to take a very balanced approach and not just harp on the way individual human rights or rights of certain religious groups are concerned, because your right to convert another person could actually be affecting the dignity of another human being. You say that your right to practice your religion is to convert entire world into your own religious sect, for which you will use any mean, whether it is money, fraud, inducement, deception, and violence. So again, as upholders of human rights and religious freedom, we have to balance all these factions and see what is right in one particular situation or the other. When we talk about the discourse of human rights, we go to, Code of Hammurabi, which is from around time of, in the Western sphere, from around time of 1750 BC. But even prior to that, in the same ancient Mesopotamia, there was an earlier code of Arnammu that was around 2050 years BC. And in that particular code, every crime was sort of followed by a punishment to be inflicted. There were business contracts for proper pricing of goods, family and criminal laws. The reason I'm bringing that part of historical this thing is that as long as human society has existed, there have been rules, regulations, laws, and rights of individuals. So to say that the concept of human rights or human rights movement started only after World War II of the Nazi Holocaust, I think is fallacious. It is very, very myopic understanding of human history. On the, in this code of Arnammu, basically, there was guard of justice who handed over laws to the king, and king was a middleman who administered those laws on behalf of the guard of justice to the general population. Uh, so there were different ways. If you look at Eastern civilization, Indian civilization has been fairly ancient, compared to any Western records. And the ancient Indian texts of Vedas do talk about Raj Dharma or duty of the ruler. There is a concept of karma which, enshrines the concept of human duty and responsibilities. So again, we see in an ancient Eastern civilization, these are concepts, meant for common good, invoking duties, responsibilities, and human dignity. And I think we just cannot be bound by what happened in Second World War and how the concept of arose. I think we have to modify these concept of human rights, looking at a much more, wider and much more deeper historical look in looking at various societies. If you look at ancient China, ancient China had, certain norms and concepts which were given by Confucius, who focused on responsible behavior towards others to the best of one's capacity. And following Confucius, there were other philosophers like Mo Zhu, who gave the Mohist school of moral philosophy, and Mengzi around 370 BC, who was a follower or student of Confucius, again talked about all humans being, sharing the same humanity. So what happened that in the medieval times, once religion was codified in the form of religions of the book, the three religions of book, we had a lot of historical strife with these three religions of books trying to propagate each and every of their religion, in that process causing strife and causing the death, destruction, and pillage of the non-believers. And it led to a lot of human misery. If you look at the Crusades, the other religious campaigns, out of the national boundaries from where these religions arose, there was a lot of violation of human rights. So just to simply say that Nazis slaughtered 6 million Jews, and that's how human rights history or human rights movement started, I think is very fallacious. We have to take a much longer historical point of view and not gloss over historical mistakes or lessons learned from other parts of the world and not just focus on the Western concept of human rights. We do talk about, United Nations coming out and all. And Ripudaman, you did talk about, how the victors treated the vanquished. War is a very dirty business, but it is also true that Allied soldiers, after surrender of Germany, Nazis Germany, did rape German women. Although the Allied powers, following Victor's justice, did start the trial of Nuremberg, but they did not try their own forces, for war crimes. In the Second World War, there were war crimes done by each and every party. And it was not just the Nazi Germany. So if you see the Axis powers, Japan committed human rights violations, whether they were in Korean Peninsula or in China or in Southeast Asia. There was a famous Burmese railway in which the Allied soldiers were enslaved and were used as forced labor. Korean women were used as comfort women for the sexual comfort of Japanese soldiers. And there are some allegations that Japanese soldiers did indulge in cannibalism in Southeast Asia during Second World War. If you look at other Axis powers, I won't talk about Nazi Germany, but even Italy, under the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, committed similar human rights violations in North Africa and Italian colonies in the Africa. So we know that there's a lot of documentation about human rights violations, not just by Nazi Germany, but other Axis powers. But what about Allied forces' human rights violations? Some of them you mentioned, Ripudaman. There was a lot of bombing of civilian populations done by Allied powers also. Uh, you know, and of course, around the same time, while the Second World War was going on, and after that also, there were very famous Tuskegee experiments happening in the United States. What happened in Tuskegee experiments, that a number of African American citizens were denied treatment of syphilis just because the US medical fraternity wanted to study the natural course of untreated syphilis. This was at a time when treatment for syphilis was available. Tuskegee experiments were continued till late 50s. So we have, we can have high moral standards in Western societies, but, people have not looked into their own situation introspectively. United States still has not apologized for use of nuclear weapons in the Second World War to terminate the Second World War. And from a military point of view, one can say that yes, you are justifying use of atomic weapons to terminate the Second World War. Maybe it was okay for the first time. What about the second time? 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, there was bombing of Nagasaki. How ethically and morally, with whatever compass, you can justify use of the second atomic bomb? So again, the way we conceptualize the human rights, the way the movement has been given a boost in post-Second World War situation, basically smacks of victor's justice. And we continue to see the same thing as victor's justice and weaponization of human rights as a political movement that has replaced the physical colonialism from intellectual colonialism. We have unjustified wars that were, you know, invoked on grounds of weapons of mass destruction when none were found. During that particular Middle Eastern war, 500,000 Iraqi children died because of the sanctions. Was anyone held responsible for that? In late 90s, there was a famous Madeleine's War in which there was bombing of civilian infrastructure of former Yugoslavian state of Serbia for an extended period of time to soften Slobodan Milosevic's government. So again, we can talk about all the international covenants, international, treaties, but how we, sort of adhere to these treaties and covenants depends upon each nation and their power hierarchy. And that has to change if there has to be a concept of universal human rights. So we have a lot of deficiency, we have a lot of areas where we have to work on. The last thing I will say, the concept of human rights is a good concept, but in Western societies, the concept has been hijacked by extremist individuals and organizations with dubious agenda and dubious credentials. You have human rights and aid organizations, using sex as a bargaining power in certain third world countries to give access to certain, food or other benefits. It's very well documented. Human rights movements are there, then you have piecemeal approach, women's rights movements, children's rights movements, of course, animal rights movements, each one working in their own silos. And unfortunately, sometimes people who purport to be having a moralistic and ethical point of view have used violence and terror to terrorize people they hold responsible. So very good example is that of PETA, People for Ethical Treatment of Animals. What does PETA do? They use terror, they use violence against people they feel are not cooperating with their agenda. But if I can quote certain ancient Hindu texts, they were always concerned not only about humans, but also people or living beings who had four legs. They always sort of prayed for welfare of not only the human beings, but also for the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. So having compartmentalization and taking a very extremist, narrow agenda does not serve the purpose of human rights. It is hijacked and it is usurped. Again, in the contemporary society, this extremist viewpoint about the rights with a narrow sectarian approach. People who are advocating the rights of an unborn child are killing doctors, are killing healthcare workers, and again utilizing violence without batting an eyelid. So you have lot of dichotomies here, lot of hypocrisy, lot of extremist agenda purporting as human rights concern or human rights workers, there's need for much more balanced thinking. And there's a need for learning from the history of other civilizations. The human rights violations are pretty much in every era, in every country, because exceptions do happen. And each society has to have some self-correct, correcting mechanisms that deal with it. Let's look at the communist China. 40 million people died under two campaigns by Communist Party of China, led by Mao. You know, one was the Great Leap Forward, and second was Cultural Revolution. Was anyone brought to justice for that? Nobody. So again, whoever is strong will escape human rights violations. And you have examples after examples, country by country. So in order to, maintain the human dignity, we cannot just have a rights or law-based approach. There has to be some moral standing about ethical behaviors at all levels of society, whether that are governments, that are individuals, that are religious groups, whether that's corporate sectors. And of course, we have now terrorist organizations who have no qualms about human rights. So situation is very complex, and just harping on international organizations and international treaties is not the answer, because it's good, grandstanding to the audience that we are for this, we are for that. But what we are doing actually in our own country is very different. I will open this for discussion now, and anybody can ask questions to Ripudaman or me, and we will jointly have a discussion because we have another half an hour for Q&A. So we are a small group, so anyone can ask the question. No need to go through the chat function.
I guess I'll go first. um, just in terms of like the history and then the continuing evolution of the human rights discourse, I was wondering whether cultural and political positions that were considered against human rights in the past may come back into fashion now in a way that it is not against the spirit of human rights. In other words, that human rights is a constantly adapting uh, sort of uh, sort of ecology. Like for instance, earlier there was this idea of separate but equal in the United States, and there were of course Jim Crow laws. The fact was that it was separate, but it was never really equal, of course. However, and so then what happened was that those were removed, and then kind of social engineering was done, or at least been attempted to be done in order to empower, uh, um, the African American community, assuming that at some point they become self-sustaining and a prosperous community in their own right. Do you think it's possible that um, the idea of what Nick Taleb calls fractal localism will catch on? Because it seems like that's happening anyway. At a grassroots level, there's a tension between this top-down governance and social engineering, which tends to dilute every culture under its purview. There's a tension between that model and between the idea of a localized, complex, kind of a polycentric ecology, where each culture has its own dominant space to work in. And even if you look at the international scenario, there's a move towards a multipolar world and so forth. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that, or what you think would be the right direction to go in, at least at this point?
I think you have already kind of hinted the answers. And this is what I'm trying to say, that there's not one way of maintaining human dignity. In all my discussion of Ripudaman's presentation, I've talked about, need to less emphasize on stringent demand for individuals' rights versus all aspects of human diamond, whether it is dignity of a particular individual or duties or responsibilities. And depending upon the society concerned, nation concerned, nobody is trying to deny the existence of human rights, but each system requires a separate model conducive to the local situation. What may be true of United States may not be true of, let's say, Sri Lanka. Each place has different dynamics, different history, So yes, United States has gone through a lot of evolution, a lot of phases. Some of those are, the interventions that were done may not be working now, and there's a counter reaction to that. So again, rather than, humping the bully pulpit, shouting from the rooftop that this is the only way, this is my way, this is the only way we can ensure human dignity, I think there's need for much more balanced approach, taking into consideration local, historical, and cultural sensitivities. Now that would not and that should not dilute the concept of human dignity. And I am again not talking about human rights the way it is conceptualized today, but I'm focusing much more on human dignity with emphasis on both individual rights as well as collective rights, and not demeaning other individuals at the same time, while focusing on each individual's and each organization's collective and individual responsibility and duty. Because unless that societal superego is not there, any bunch of laws are not going to achieve anything. You just have a set of laws which are just on the paper. I mean, if you look at in certain autocratic countries, there are laws, but they are never adhered to. You have a good model constitution in China, but people don't have the freedoms under that situation. So we have to have very balanced viewpoint and not be sort of wedded to a dogma. The moment you become dogmatic, you lose the sensitivity about human lives, and not just human lives, any kind of life. Christina, any comments from you?
Yes, I really think that balancing rights and responsibilities and duty and human rights compared with making sure that we find a way of slowly infusing into global cultures the idea that, yeah, we have our individual rights, but they shouldn't impose on other people. I think that that's going to take multiple generations to do, and probably some advocacy, at maybe even the congressional level, to see what we can do to get individual school systems involved in creating some sort of educational format from a very early age, because we can't guarantee that kids will be learning these concepts at home. So how would we even begin to go about this? Because we have No Child Left Behind, and we have some prior common core concepts that came out, and then now you've got teachers leaving the industry because they don't like the new ways of doing things, and then there's the not interfering at the local level, and keeping the federal government outside of local and state policy, particularly with the education system. So for me personally, this is out of my scope, and I have no idea where we would begin to address that with the delicate balance between federal and state and local policy. But it seems clear that at some point this needs to be infused in the education system at a very early age.
You're right that there needs to be much more emphasis on some of the issues. I think respecting the dignity of the other human being, that becomes the challenging issue. How we inculcate this as a universal concept rather than othering, you know. And time and again, because of certain group affiliations, the process of othering happens and it is universal. And all of us are blind to our own othering biases. Again, we say that our belief system is the most avant-garde, most egalitarian. Our constitution is the most egalitarian. Our society is the most egalitarian. But then when we look at the nuances, when we look at the internal inconsistencies and contradictions, as an objective observer with dispassionate, attitude, you find everything to the pieces, I think it's a very, very difficult process, when a government does not keep its own word, we are having a situation that us, a federal government that has signed a number of treaties with various, First Nations or sovereign native nations, has historically and continues to, renege on those treaties and violations for very, marginalized people. I think that tells you how we keep other people's human dignity in esteem. So there are issues at every level, and I think we need to give up the selfish attitude and start from somewhere where we are concerned about everyone's well-being rather than just one narrow segments, that my religion, my group, my race, my community, my town, or my government, or my country. My country has to win at every cost. I want to tap the hydrocarbon potential of Iraq so I can tell lies and start a war because that, helps my military industrial complex. You know, so I think there's a lack of sincerity and lack of ethical morality in powers that be. And when that attitude percolates top down, you're not going to have a change in hearts. So there's need for self-introspection at every level, as we are doing just lip service to the concept of human dignity, or we genuinely believe in that process. And unless that happens, the society will not change. So need for self-introspection is there. Krishna, do you have any questions or comments?
No, sir. I have more on how I have questions on Amnesty International, how they view human rights based on geography. So I'll I'll ask those questions next week probably when you're present.
Okay. Professor Pathak, do you have any comments? We are a small group. Yes, he's not available. Mr. Harilal Patel, do you have any comments? Okay. Anyone that has last minute comments or comments? Ripudaman, do you have any central message of your presentation?
Yeah, as I said, Adityanjee, the ethics and the moral values should be the guiding factor for all the human rights laws that are being formed and um, are currently exist. Um, and we should work on developing the morals within the society, as Christina also said, introduce at some level at the school level, um, rather than um, basically devising laws on case-to-case basis. Um, so that's what I wanted to say.
Okay, so next week, I think our new fellow, Anushri Gisard, she will be presenting on international covenants and international treaties. And the faculty preceptor is Professor Nanda, who is a legal scholar. So we'll discuss more about the international treaties and all. Today's discussion was more historical, more philosophical rather than post World War II, what happened. But I'm very thankful to all of you who came on a Friday evening. People generally spend their happy Friday somewhere else, but to a very esoteric discussion on human rights and religious freedom, I think calls for a lot of sacrifice in your personal lives. So I'm very thankful, and we shall meet again next Friday for the next seminar. And we shall be just bringing our special report on Kashmiri Hindu genocide sometime later during this month. So we'll have an event for public release of that report. Thank you very much indeed to all the people, all the team, ICHRRF, and we hope to see you next Friday.
Thank you, Adityanjee.
Thank you all.
Thank you.